Great. So thank you so much for inviting me and for that lovely introduction. And I'm actually local to you all. I'm zooming from New Rochelle, so just down the road. And I'm really happy to be invited. So I'm going to just share my screen because, like every archaeologist, I can't talk without slides. So I'm almost there. Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is about politics and archaeology with particular reference to the archaeology of Israel. And I want to start by saying that I teach an entire course on politics and archaeology. So this is just a taste. It's the tip of a huge iceberg of interrelated topics. So for instance, have you ever noticed the timing of archaeological news? It usually falls around holidays. So here's an example from last week, which happens to be an Easter example, not a Passover example, the rediscovery of a Crusader period altar in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem that was found during renovations of the church. Imagine the announcement of find from the traditional site of Jesus's tomb at Easter, right? That's very eye-catching, and it's a way of making archaeology seem relevant to today by emphasizing continuity from past and present, which is a form of politicization, as we're going to see. Archaeology is present at every level of politics. On the very local level, whenever you build a new structure, anything from a house to a condo complex to a bridge, like the Tappan Zee, the Mario Cuomo, you have to do an archaeological survey of the area first. This is the law in most countries. And if archaeologists find anything in the survey, it has to be completely excavated before any construction can take place. And these laws have prevented the destruction of cultural heritage really throughout the world. Another aspect of archaeology and politics that you've probably all heard about at some point when these two things come together is in wartime. Archaeological sites are used as pawns during the war. I could cite multiple examples, but here's one from just a few years ago when ISIS purposefully destroyed archaeological sites in Syria and northern Iraq because they represented both pre-Islamic ideology and also Western interest in Iraq and Syria. And they did worse than this as well. They actually publicly they beheaded a well-known Syrian archaeologist at the archaeological site where he'd spent his career. Right now, the war in the Ukraine is raging, and we're mostly hearing about horrific civilian deaths. But once the dust settles, as we hope it will sooner rather than later, we're going to start hearing a lot more about Ukrainian loss of cultural heritage, destruction of Ukrainian archaeological sites. But so all that is part of politics and archaeology. But today I'm going to talk about something kind of larger, something worldwide. Worldwide, ancient history and archaeology are often taken out of context to make arguments about current political conflicts. And this is true on both sides of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So I'm going to present you with three specific cases this morning. The first one doesn't come from Israel, rather from Egypt. And why am I going to take you to Egypt? Because that's where the modern discipline of archaeology was born. And by looking at the dawn of professional archaeology, we're going to see how archaeology and politics have been really completely linked since the very beginning. And then we're going to move on to two examples from Israel. We're going to look at Masada, and then we're going to look at Jerusalem. So that's the plan. So to Egypt, oops, there we go, to Egypt and to Napoleon.
So I'm sorry, can I just say that there is some background noise coming from your microphone? It looks like you.
Okay.
Great.
It's possible that is it my clicking of my mouse? Or maybe my shuffling of my papers?
Maybe shuffle.
Yeah, maybe it could be shuffling of your papers, but now it seems to be fine.
Okay, I'll try not to shuffle, or not to shuffle quite as much. So, so Napoleon, who you probably didn't expect to hear about today, but he's where it all started. Napoleon led military campaigns into Egypt early in his career in 1798, and his intention was to conquer Egypt as another way to undermine British access to India by disrupting trade routes. And his excuse was to help the Ottoman Empire put down a Mamluk uprising. So from a military point of view, there are two key battles that he fought. From a military point of view, his march into Egypt was really a failure. He won one battle, the Battle of the Pyramids in 1798, but then he lost the following year, 1799. He lost the Battle of Abu Qir and he turned tail and left Egypt. But believe it or not, military victory was not Napoleon's only goal in entering Egypt. So while he lost militarily, he actually won another sort of war. For educated Westerners, the ancient history of Egypt was well known. Greek historians had described Egypt's culture and ancient history, and everyone who attended university read this. The great temples and monuments of Egypt, here's the Sphinx, were still visible on the landscape for adventurous Westerners to visit, should they choose to. And Napoleon, who was very well educated in ancient history, had long equated himself with Alexander the Great, who had conquered Egypt back in the 4th century BC. And he alternately thought of himself as a modern day pharaoh. And as you can see from these quotes, he's constantly associating himself with ancient history in his writings. So knowing this, we can understand Napoleon's non-military goal in coming to Egypt, which was to conquer ancient Egypt culturally, to make himself the ruler of ancient Egypt by cultural dominance of the land and its archaeology. When he arrived in Egypt in 1798, he came with 328 ships with his huge army of 38,000 men. And most of these, of course, were soldiers, but 167 of these men were not soldiers. They were his savants, as he called them, his scholars, his scientists. They included, I'm going to read a list really fast. They included astronomers, mathematicians, chemists, mineralogists, linguistic experts, technicians, painters, poets, engineers, mechanics, balloonists, doctors, zoologists, botanists, draftsmen, architects, antiquarians, musicians, and political economists. Okay, so he brought all of these people because he wanted to know in a much more modern scientific manner about the history of ancient Egypt. And these savants, these scholars, were part of an institute that Napoleon helped found, the Institut de l'Egypte, which was founded in Paris at the same time. And the mission of this institute was to conduct studies about ancient Egypt. So these scholars, and you can see them in this slide, sort of all over the monuments of ancient Egypt, measuring, copying, making plans, they collected animal and plant and mineral specimens. They collected stone reliefs and sarcophagi to take home. Anything that wasn't rooted to the ground, they took home with them, ultimately to France. Some was confiscated by the British. Famously, the British, the French found the Rosetta Stone, but the British confiscated it, and it's still today in the British Museum. In the end, even though they were the army was only in Egypt for a couple of years, Napoleon's scholars produced 31 large-scale volumes known as the Description de l'Egypte, published between 1809 and 1828. It was a huge undertaking that began the academic study of ancient Egypt. Okay, so what does this have to do with politics? Well, let's look at this a little bit more closely. a couple of scholars have looked at the implications of Napoleon's discovery of Egypt. Egypt, of course, was there long before Napoleon got there, but he's credited with bringing Egypt into the modern world. There's a wonderful 1995 article by a scholar named Anna Godleska, who examined the images in this multi-volume work, in the 31 volumes of the Description. And we're going to take a quick look at first the frontispiece of this volume. Obviously, I'm not going to go through every little piece of symbolism here. The top, I'll just mention that the top and the bottom of the frame show the conquest of the Mamluks by the French, and it's all put into Roman imagery. You can see this Roman style chariot here. Here's a big N with a crown on it. You can guess that that symbolizes Napoleon, the victor. And along the sides are the names of all the battles that Napoleon fought, not just in Egypt, but he went on to other parts of the Middle East, including Ottoman Palestine. He lost most of the battles, but he included them anyway. But I want us to look in the middle, the main part of this image. And here you can see a composite of everything having to do with ancient Egypt. You can see this obelisk, you can see pylons of a variety of temples, you can see sculptures of Egyptian gods, and running through the middle here, you can see this windy thing. This is the Nile River. But you know what you're not seeing? You're not seeing anything modern. You're not seeing anything Islamic. There's no people in here at all. What is it that Westerners cared about and respected about ancient Egypt? Well, it was the ancient part. They didn't have any interest in modern Egypt or its modern people. And Godleska drives this point home by looking at all of the plates in the 31 volumes, all of the images. And she points out that the drawing of the maps of Egypt was actually a way of controlling Egypt for European use. The maps were all made on a scale of 1 to 86,000, which was the established norm for mapping France. So this was a physical linking of Egypt and France politically. Cartography as a way of controlling. And another thing I want to point out about this is all the detailed areas. These represent the ancient ruins of Luxor, part of the complex of Thebes in southern Egypt. But you see this blank area here? That blank area is actually where the modern Arab village of Luxor was located. So the French left the modern town as just a flat blank. That's what they thought of the modern Egyptians. They respected the ancient and they did not respect the modern. If we look at a couple of other images, we can see this repeated rather regularly. Here's one of Napoleon's scholars sitting over here. He's busy drawing an ancient statue group. Now he's sitting on the same level of the lower part of the ancient group. So he's equating himself with them a little bit, but yet he's also kind of below them, right? But you have to contrast this with the Arab, okay, his Arab assistant, who's sitting there lazily smoking on a lower level than the Frenchman and on a much lower level than the statue group that represents ancient Egypt. And then there's this one. I like this one, where the Frenchman, the scholar, is drawing this colossal statue. And on first glance, it looks like ancient Egypt is much bigger than France, right? Ancient Egypt versus France. But please note that France's foot is on top of ancient Egypt's foot, symbolizing how France has conquered and tamed ancient Egypt for itself. And the same can be seen in these images of the Sphinx. Frenchmen are climbing on and measuring and thereby taming the Sphinx, taming Egypt for their own use. And we can see this political conquest of Egypt in another way as well. Before we move on to Israel, I just want to talk about one other way of demonstrating political conquest through archaeology. Another scholar, Donald Reed, wrote a book a few years ago called Whose Pharaohs? Archaeology Museums and Egyptian National Identity from Napoleon to World War I. And Reed talks about how ever since the time of Napoleon, all scholarship on ancient Egypt was Western, and Western scholars, and especially the French and the British, almost fully excluded local scholars from participating. And this actually remained the case until the 1952 revolution. You could even argue that this remained the case straight into the 1990s in some ways. So here are two plates. I've sort of cobbled these two plates from his book together. On the left, you can see all the famous European scholars who worked in Egypt during the 18th and 19th centuries. And here are just a few names on the right, local Egyptian scholars. All of these names are very famous to those of us who study archaeology. None of us Westerners, even to today, have really heard of these people. The local scholars, when they were allowed to participate at all, were really fully marginalized by the French and later by the British. Can see it another way as well. Guidebooks in a variety of languages that were published between the 1830s and World War I. You can see that as we go forward in time, more and more guidebooks are published. That is, more and more foreign tourists come to visit Egypt. You can see a lot of English language ones, French ones, some German ones, a few others. You know what's not on this chart? There are no guidebooks published in Arabic, not a single one. So the locals were not seen as interested at all in their own heritage. Ancient Egypt is for Westerners. It's not for the locals. They were completely removed from the scholarship in which they lived. Last point on this topic. This is an image of the facade, the front of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And if you look, you can see all these little plaques all over the front. If we focus in on, on any one of them, here we go. If we focus in on this one, you can see, I know it's very small print here, but you can see that all of these names are of Western scholars who participated in the scholarship on ancient Egypt in the 18th and early 19th century, really. So again, marginalization of the locals, taking the ancient history away from the local residents, conquering Egypt culturally through archaeology as a way of political dominance. What did the Western archaeologists think of the locals? Well, the locals were certainly good for something. They were good as dragomans, that is, as tour guides, so that fancy European ladies who wanted to see the pyramids wouldn't get their dresses dirty, and helped to climb these huge blocks of the. And of course, the locals were also good as workmen, laborers, so that the Westerners could have a workforce to dig the ruins of the greatness of ancient Egypt. Definitely, the locals are not intellectual counterparts. Europe has used archaeology as a way to degrade the modern peoples and modern culture of Egypt while appropriating the grandeur of antiquity itself. So what we've seen so far is that archaeology was born from nationalism and colonialism. And of course, the discipline has grown away from that in the last 100 years. But that doesn't mean that nationalism has abandoned archaeology as a tool, quite the opposite. So with this as our background, we're going to turn to something more familiar and more recent, how politics, nationalism, and archaeology interact with each other in Israel today. So Masada will be our first example, and this is going to show us how Israel has played hard and fast with archaeological material to promote nationalistic feelings. And our second example will be from Jerusalem, which will show how the Palestinian political leadership willfully misinterprets and misunderstands and even tries to erase archaeological data in an attempt to delegitimize Israel. So let's start with Masada. which is one of the main tourist sites in Israel and has been for decades. A typical day trip from Jerusalem includes watching the sunrise at Masada, taking a dip in the Dead Sea, which you can see in the background there, and finishing up often with another dip in the refreshing freshwater waters of the Ein Gedi oasis. Masada is very touristy today. It has been since at least the 1970s. It's set up with a convenient parking lot and a cable car, which you can see in the image, so that the climb isn't an issue. And there's very good signage at the top, so you know exactly what you're seeing, or you think you do. Okay, well, most of us probably are familiar with the story of Masada as described by the Roman Jewish historian Josephus. So let's quickly go through that familiar story. Masada had been originally built by Herod, the Roman appointed governor of the Roman province of Judea. And it was then used as a Roman fortress for about 100 years. And Herod built it, I should say, in the 30s BC, first century BC. About 100 years later, when Rome had tightened its hold on the province, the Jews rebelled against Roman rule. And the Romans fought really strongly against these rebels, and they even sent, and the rebellion began in 66. By 68, the Romans had sent in their extremely strong 10th Legion into Jerusalem, and the 10th Legion really burned the city and destroyed the temple in the year 70. But a small group of rebels, known often as the Zealots, escaped to Masada and holed up there for a while. When the Romans finally started to break through their defenses, these rebels chose to commit mass suicide rather than let the Romans kill them. So if we were in person, I would probably see a lot of you nodding your heads, because this is a fairly well-known story to people with an interest in Jewish history. And Masada, it's not exactly a victory for the ancient Jews. It isn't a defeat either, right? And as such, it gradually became a symbol of resilience for Jews and for the modern state of Israel. But here's the thing. The story of Masada, as I just summarized, the one that every tourist and Jewish school child knows, is actually a very cleaned up version of Josephus's account. And some scholars have even called it the Masada myth. Several scholars have written about it. Notably, the scholar Nachman ben Yehuda, who wrote these two books, The Masada Myth and Sacrificing the Truth, Archaeology and the Myth of Masada. Because the real story of Masada is rather different than what I just presented to you. There's a lot more unflattering details, and these details have been expunged over the years to give you the story that we're all familiar with. So let's start with the term zealot, okay? Josephus sometimes uses the term zealot to describe these rebels who hold up in Masada, but just as often and really interchangeably, he uses another term, sicarii. Sicarii means dagger men. It's a Latin term, means dagger men, stabbers. And sometimes Josephus refers to this group of people at Masada simply as robbers. Okay, both of these terms, robbers and dagger men, are a lot less flattering than zealots, which really implies people who were enthusiastic about their cause. And this group of zealots or dagger men were simply one faction of the Jews in Jerusalem who wanted to rebel. Most Jews in Jerusalem actually didn't want to rebel because they were afraid of Roman reactions and retaliations, and they were right to be afraid of Roman retaliations. So note how the term zealot is used in the cleaned up telling of the story. The rebels of Masada are heroes. They're not daggermen. They're not robbers. But the truth is that this faction actually terrorized the majority of the Jews who didn't want to go along with the rebellion. So what did they do? They did a bunch of things that weren't very pretty. They, first of all, terrorized the other Jews in Jerusalem who didn't want to go along with their violence. Then they violently killed the entire Roman garrison on Masada, and they killed more Romans in Jerusalem. I suppose all is fair in wartime, so killing Romans, perhaps we should not be too hard on them for doing that. But then when the Romans in retaliation sent the 10th Legion into Jerusalem, the people who had started the rebellion, these zealots, Sicarii robbers, didn't help. They didn't come to the assistance of the Jews of Jerusalem. They ran back to Masada and let the Jews of Jerusalem fend for themselves. And again, the entire city was burned, the temple was burned, and a lot of people died at Roman hands. And that was thanks to the zealots' actions and then lack of action, not coming back to help the people actually living in Jerusalem. And another thing they did, once they're up on Masada, this is a great fortress, very well protected, hard to climb up to, which is why it's a great way to wait out a war. But it's also hard to get supplies. It's not like they had farmland attached to their fortress of Masada. So how did they get supplies? Well, they raided nearby settlements. Most notably, in the year 68, they raided the Jewish village of Ein Gedi, and they stole all their crops and took all their livestock and let the people on Passover, actually, of 68, and they let all the people of Ein Gedi starve. So that's not a very pleasant detail. So as the Masada myth has developed, all this was expunged. The term Sicarii disappears, the Ein Gedi massacre disappears, their actions and lack of action in Jerusalem disappears. So who started the expunging? It was this man, Shmaryahu Gutman. He was an agronomist, an agriculturalist from the local kibbutz, and we're talking about the early 1950s. Modern Israel was a brand new state, and the extent of the horrors of the Holocaust were just becoming known to the public. Gutman saw the story of Masada as a story of heroism, one that redefined Jews not as victims to circumstance or enemies, but as a people who don't give up against all odds, who are in charge of their own destinies. The story of Masada ends ambiguously, right? A suicide is not a victory, but it's not a defeat either. And it's definitely dramatic. And this is what Gutman saw in the story, and eventually what the public saw. Gutman convinced archaeologists, including Michael Aviona, Joseph Avigad, Yochanan Aharoni, Emmanuel Dunayevsky, to excavate Masada in 1955. And later, Gutman convinced Yigal Yadin to excavate it in the 1960s. And the Yadin excavations became very, very famous. In fact, and this is pretty important, they were known to the public. These excavations were known to the public before the final reports were published academically. And there was tremendous public interest. Newspaper reporters were going to the excavations practically every day, and several books were published aimed at popular audiences. And one of them was published by Yadin himself in 1966, before the excavations were even finished. So Yadin was already a very high profile person before embarking on his archaeological career. He had been in military affairs and in politics, and specifically, he had served as the chief of staff for the Israeli army before archaeology. And by the time of his excavations, the Masada myth was already deeply entrenched. And the excavations themselves became so famous for themselves that they entrenched the myth even farther, even more deeply. So first of all, the excavations were groundbreaking. These were the first excavations to use volunteers, students, and others. And this started a model that's still used in Israel today. Using student volunteers starts off young Jews on a physical connection to the land of Israel and the history of the Jews. Secondly, the government had to get involved. Because of all the civilians, non-professionals who were working there in this hot, dry desert with no proper supplies available to them, they needed to extend the Israel water pipeline 7.5 kilometers to get water to the large number of people working there. And Yadin, who still had many government connections, had the influence to get this done. So talk about a connection between politics and archaeology. And here we're coming to the crux of it. The myth making was really part of Yadin's excavations. So if we look at this slide here, this image, here you can see the stronghold of Masada itself, Herod's famous palace complex. One of them is off this slope over here. Here is one of the many Roman base camps right over here. And actually the Roman base camps at Masada are some of the best preserved Roman base camps anywhere in the Roman Empire. Here's the Roman siege ramp, which they built to eventually get up to the top of the fortress. So these are some of the key elements to Masada. And if we look within the stronghold itself, here's a top plan of the stronghold. We can see a couple of structures that immediately caught the attention of the public. So one of these structures was immediately identified as a synagogue, this building right in here. And another one was immediately identified as a ritual Jewish bathhouse, a mikveh. Okay, so let's look. Here is the synagogue, what it looks like, and its plan. And here is the mikveh, the ritual bathhouse. And the press and the public were both really excited about these structures. And the rabbinate was excited too. Members of the rabbinate came to visit the site in February of 1964 and said about this mikveh, this ritual bathhouse, that it was amazing that Jews were worshiping in recognizably Jewish ways 2,000 years ago. Except that there were problems with these structures. They didn't look right from an archaeological point of view. The synagogue is a little older than any other known synagogue in all of ancient Judea. And when you finally get synagogues, they don't look exactly like the structure. They don't have this little storeroom area over here. None of them do. So this might be a synagogue, okay, but it might not be. And the mikveh was even more problematic. It's pretty small. You'd have to crouch down significantly to immerse yourself in it. So sure, it could be a mikveh, but it also could just be a vat for water storage. And more to the point, what would Sicarii, daggermen, what use would they have for a synagogue and a mikveh? Was religious worship their main concern? Well, maybe. And if it wasn't, were these structures built earlier by Herod? Would Herod have built a synagogue and a mikveh? Herod, who was much more Roman than he was Jewish. Should I mention that there were a lot of pig bones found from all the archaeological strata of these structures and also elsewhere on the site? There are some issues here. Also, skeletons were found, human skeletons were found in various places on the site. And for the press reports, the excavator, Yadin, speculated that at least one group of these skeletons were the remains of the last warriors left alive during the mass suicide. But a later scholar, Josias, analyzed and published the skeletons and the finds associated with them. And so you can see some of the finds here, sandals and spearheads. Zaius understood that Romans Roman soldiers wore sandals of this type and used this kind of weaponry. And it was much more likely that these were remains of Roman soldiers who died in battle on Masada than of the Jewish rebels. The mass suicide itself has been called into question by the scholar Shaya Cohn, who points out that lots and lots of ancient Greek and Roman writers used mass suicides as a motif in their writings, and mass suicides are attributed to all of these ancient peoples. Again, this doesn't mean that the mass suicide on Masada didn't happen, but it doesn't give us as much great confidence in the story as we otherwise might have. Back to the burials for a minute. In spite of the fact that these were probably Roman remains, in 1969, these probable Roman human remains were reburied as ancient Jewish martyrs in a Jewish religious ceremony with coffins draped with Israeli flags, as you can see here. And for many years, Masada was a location for swearing in ceremonies for the Israeli army. In other words, in Israel, Masada is the ultimate fusion of politics, nationalism, and archaeology. The story of Masada and even its archaeological remains have been appropriated or co-opted by the nationalist agenda. Okay, we're going to change gears now. And lest you think at this point that I'm somehow blaming the Israelis for misusing archaeology, let me assure you that absolutely every nation on the globe does something like this. And with that thought, I want to turn to the most contentious of archaeological places in the entire world, Jerusalem. So here is the size of and location of ancient Jerusalem transposed onto a map that shows us the urban sprawl of modern Jerusalem. And for those of you who have visited Jerusalem, you can see the old city outlined right around here. Jerusalem's ancient and later history is important to several religions for many reasons. And if we just go through all this extremely quickly, you will remember perhaps that the Hebrew Bible talks about David conquering Jerusalem from the Canaanites. This would have been in around the 10th century, and David used it as a capital city. His son Solomon built that first temple in Jerusalem, which stood for about 400 years until the Babylonians destroyed it. And then in the 6th century, and then it was rebuilt in the Persian period when the Jews were allowed back into Jerusalem, what we call the Second Temple. And that temple stood for about 500 years. In the 1st century BC, we've already noted Herod, who built Masada, he also did a major refurbishment project of that Second Temple. So that took place in this time frame as well. In the 1st century, here we go. The Temple Mount platform, which is still standing today, was built by Herod. A little bit later in the 1st century of the Common Era, after the Romans destroy the temple in the year 70 BC, but a little bit later, 100 years later, Jerusalem becomes holy to Christianity. Jesus preaches in Jerusalem and he's died and he's buried there. And part of Christian belief, of course, is that he's resurrected from there as well. And it becomes a place of pilgrimage for Christians from that point forward. And then you jump ahead a couple of hundred years until the birth of Islam in the 7th century, when Jerusalem becomes holy to Islam, because it becomes associated with a mysterious place mentioned in the Quran, Al-Aqsa, the sort of landing place of Muhammad's night journey to the farthest. Al-Aqsa means the farthest, and that mysterious place became associated with Jerusalem. So Jerusalem obviously is important to all three major world religions. And like Rome and Athens, Jerusalem is very difficult to excavate because there are modern structures, often religious structures, pretty much covering every foot of ancient Jerusalem, especially located over the heart of where ancient Jerusalem would have been. The Temple Mount area is an active place of worship for Jews and Muslims today. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most important place for Christianity, is a little bit farther away. Somewhere, let me see what my next slide is. Yeah, somewhere under this area, this area here, is where the remains of the Second Temple, and under that, the First Temple would be located. And then down here, what we refer to as the City of David, the lower part of this oval here, reconstructed here, is often known as, well, it's known as the City of David area. This was the heart and soul of the population for Iron Age period Jerusalem, biblical period Jerusalem. So even without the ability to do proper excavation under the temple, in order to excavate under the temple, you would have to essentially destroy the Dome of the Rock and other active Muslim religious structures on the Temple Mount platform. Even without being able to do that, there has been about 70 years, more than 70 years worth of archaeological work in Jerusalem, a lot of it taking place in the area known as the City of David. And a lot of it dates to the biblical period, the height of the kingdom of Judah, oh, I'm sorry, I just wanted to show you an image of the Temple Mount area. We've been talking about this oval. So here is the Muslim Dome of the Rock. The Muslim Aqsa Mosque is right here. Underneath all this, that's where the remains of the Jewish temples would be. And over here, right here, that's the City of David area, right there. And this is where, as I said a moment ago, more than 70 years of archaeological work has taken place over here. So a lot is known about biblical period Jerusalem. And here I'm just showing you basically the area right over here. Oopsie, sorry, hold on. So I'm going to show you just a few structures here. All of it dates to the Iron Age. Most of it dates to the height of the Kingdom of Judah, the 8th century through the 6th century. We're looking at a couple of houses, probably houses that belong to the elites of the city. Here we have, oops, gosh, my slides are going away. There we have what's known as the House of Achiel. Archaeologically speaking, this is a structure that's known as a 4-room house. It's hard to see that there were once upon a time 4 rooms here. You can see one room had these pillars in it. And this house structure is a type that's traditionally among archaeology experts associated with the Israelite settlement. It's called the House of Achiel because a inscription was found on an ostrakhan, on a pottery sherd used in secondary use to write on, which says Achiel. So we're using the House of Achiel. Right next to it, right down here, is a structure known as the House of the Bulli. Because in its destruction level, archaeologists found many bulli, many seal impressions originally used to seal documents, including a bulla, a seal of a man named Gemaryahu, son of Shaphan, who is a high-ranking official in the court of King Jehoiakim, who's mentioned by name in the Hebrew Bible. And these houses were both destroyed in the 6th century with the Babylonian army marching in, as was this one here, which is nicknamed the Burnt Room, because it was completely burnt. There's evidence of a really vicious fire that was part of the Babylonian destruction. And yet, in spite of all this archaeological evidence for Judahite Jerusalem and so much textual information about the temple, not everyone is willing to admit that the temple existed and that Jerusalem was ever indeed controlled by the ancient Jews or ancient Judahites. Who could possibly deny the existence of the temple and why? Well, the main deniers, I'm sorry to say, are leaders in the Palestinian Authority's administration, who have clearly stated multiple times that there never was a temple to begin with. And of course, if there never was a temple, there never was a Jewish connection to Jerusalem. And removing any historical connection of the Jews to the land of Israel and to Jerusalem is the main goal of temple denial. If there was no ancient Jewish Jerusalem, then the modern Jewish state can't use ancient history to bolster any arguments about sovereignty. So let's, let me see how I'm doing on time. Oh, I'm okay. Let's just look through some of the quotes that I have from Palestinian leadership and from the Palestinian media that exemplify this temple denial. I just have to manipulate something on my screen so I can read the quote myself. So here's something, a statement by Arafat himself a few years back. For years, the Israelis have dug tunnels around the Temple Mount. They have not found a single stone proving that the Temple of Solomon was there because historically the temple was not in Palestine at all. They only found remnants of a shrine of Roman Herod. They're now trying to put in place a number of stones so they can say we were here. This is nonsense. Okay, that's one quote from Arafat. Here is a quote from the Palestinian appointed Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. It's a religious title. The Grand Mufti is in charge of the Waqf, the administrative unit, which the Muslims have control over in Jerusalem. And this unit has existed for hundreds of years, religiously speaking. Sheikh Ikrima Sabri has said, there's not even the smallest indication of the existence of a Jewish temple on this place in the past. In the whole city, there's not even a single stone indicating Jewish history. It is the art of the Jews to deceive the world, but they can't do it to us. There is not a single stone in the Western Wall relating to Jewish history. They cannot legitimately claim this wall religiously or historically. Besides, they've already dug everywhere. All they could find is remnants of buildings from the Umayyad period. Everything they excavated was related to Arabs and Muslims, etc. More quotes from Mahmoud Abbas himself. The Israelis claim that 2,000 years ago, they had a temple on the Temple Mount platform. The Arabic term is the Haram es-Sharif. I challenge the claim that this is so. Nabil Shattakh, the Palestinian, the authorities' Minister of Planning and International Cooperation, Voice of Palestine. The Israelis are insisting on sovereignty over the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the pretext that an Israeli temple is buried beneath it. First of all, what's an Israeli temple? I don't know what that is. And that through their continued sovereignty, they can one day unearth it. Their claim was not substantiated by the excavations they carried out around the mosque. First of all, I don't know of any Israeli excavations around the mosque. However, they insisted on their demand to pray in the courtyard of the mosque. A very recent quote from last summer, following an announcement of the discovery of a first century or Roman period building near the Western Wall. This is from the Palestinian Broadcasting Corporation. These are pictures of the Israeli excavations in Jerusalem in which no archaeological existence of their alleged temple has been proven. This propaganda video is meant to attract tourists and to teach them the Israeli narrative, which has no basis other than in their heads that are full of legends and fantasies. The so-called Israeli Antiquities Authority revealed that this structure, for which they put together a story and invented a narrative that suits their lies, meant to Judaize a place that speaks nothing but its Palestinian language. Okay, well, I also really want to point something out here, that this temple denial is relatively new. Back in the 20s and the 30s, that is before the founding of the State of Israel, Muslims never disputed the existence of Jewish temples in Jerusalem and Jewish ties to the area. But now, when a moderate Palestinian professor, Sari Nusseibeh, wrote a book about a couple of years ago, talking about in which he included a discussion about the ancient Jewish ties to Jerusalem, he got terrific backlash. And he had to defend himself. And he said that I'm surprised that people are surprised by what I wrote. There's nothing in Islam that denies the fact that Judaism is one of the religions of the book. So even so when a moderate Palestinian spoke against this, the Palestinian Authority kind of quashed his moderate approach. All right, well, let's take a look at where some of this temple denial leads. In 1999 and 2000, the Waqf, this Muslim religious body that has religious jurisdiction in the Temple Mount area, the Waqf decided to build a new mosque to the southeast of the Umayyad structures on the Temple Mount in this circled area here. And during the course of construction, significant illegal digging was done in, or I should say on and around the Temple Mount platform. All the areas marked in red were dug with bulldozers, not with archaeologists supervising, but with no supervision at all. And all this was illegal digging. And here's something you need to know about archaeology before I show you all the pictures of the bulldozers at work. Archaeology is destruction, plain and simple. Once you've dug something, it's gone and you can't get it back. And that's why archaeologists record everything so carefully in multiple ways, and they draw and they photograph everything properly, and they take multiple types of measurements before removing any archaeological matrix. It's why archaeology is more akin to hard sciences than to social sciences, because of all the really careful enumeration that needs to be done. And if you don't do that, you lose everything. And of course, this illicit digging did none of that. Tons of potential archaeological information about the key archaeological area of ancient Jerusalem was simply destroyed by bulldozers. And based on the quotes from Palestinian leadership that we looked at a minute ago, you can understand why. The more that's destroyed, the less chance of anyone proving a connection of the Jews to the site through archaeological remains. So I'm going to show you a bunch of slides right now. Here's a bulldozer working on the Temple Mount, digging down sort of towards the levels where the ancient temples would be. Here is a pile of dirt simply loaded to the outskirts of the Temple Mount area. I put dirt in quotes because it's really archaeological matrix. Another bulldozer image over here. I'm so sorry, there's a phone ringing somewhere else in my room. It will stop in a moment. It stopped. So another bulldozer digging in the site that is holiest to Judaism and Islam. Construction vehicles moving mounds and mounds of dirt in the area known as Solomon's Stables. Another trench on the Temple Mount. So these construction crews dumped this dirt, all the most significant archaeological material ever uncovered in this area. They simply dumped it in the Kidron Valley and other nearby areas. But here comes the good part of the story. Oops, I can just change slides. There we go. The good part of the story. A team of archaeologists was able to conduct a salvage project of the dumped remains. The salvage project is known as the Temple Mount Sifting Project. Maybe some of you have heard of it. And it's still ongoing. It's led by archaeologists Gabi Barkai and Zaki Dvira. And the project, it's privately funded, by the way, and they had to shut down and then restart. They shut down because of lack of private funding. They just ran out of funds and had to raise more money before they could continue. It consists of hundreds of volunteers sifting through hundreds of cubic tons of debris from the illegal construction project, and a significant amount of materials from the Iron Age, from the 10th century, the beginning of the Iron Age, that is the period associated with the narratives of David and Solomon, has been found in the debris, as well as all sorts of clay bullae and other small objects from the 10th century and the 9th century and the 8th century. So here is how these volunteers work. They're set up so that they can actually do sorting. They're trained to do some basic sorting. You can see them sorting through multiple sieves. You can see that these are very sieves with very, very small grids, so you can catch even the teeniest, tiniest of artifacts. Many people working at once, because that's how huge a project it is. And just, I probably have too many pictures of people working here. And sometimes they find quite spectacular things. They're trained to recognize metal versus particular types of stones versus mosaic tiles and pottery and glass and bones. And sometimes they find fantastic things like this gold bead, 3,000-year-old gold bead dating to the time of David and Solomon, most likely, found by a 9-year-old Jerusalem boy who was volunteering for a day. So this was clearly the elite area of the city. It's the temple area of the city. So even though these salvaged artifacts were completely separated from their archaeological contexts and all stratigraphic connections were lost, they are the archaeological confirmation that there really was a major site here from the Iron Age, from the beginning of the Iron Age 2 period, right where we would expect the temple to be located. In fact, a full 42%, do the math of some of these numbers, 42% of material recovered through the sifting project dates to the First Temple period, as well as to the Hellenistic and Roman Second Temple periods combined. That is, times clearly associated with first Judahites and then Jews as the main populations. So in spite of the rather willful illicit digging on the site and the loss of so much archaeological material, all the stratigraphy, all the context, archaeology has once again shown that there was significant use of this space in the periods when the first and second temples stood. And even without proper context, we can see that this was a wealthy area. Look at our bead, as would be expected for the temple precinct. So conclusions, what's the takeaway from all this. Rather than draw conclusions along the lines of who's bad and who's good in these instances and make a blanket statement saying that no one should use archaeology for political gain, let's take a more lenient stance, okay? The first takeaway is that using archaeology to further political agendas is just what's always been done and probably always will be done. And as long as nothing is destroyed, that's actually not the end of the world. For instance, in spite of the story of Masada having become part of a nationalist agenda, Masada was actually very carefully excavated and recorded, and archaeologists can look at the final reports as well as the material saved from the excavations that's in storage and analyze it and reanalyze it with no agenda in mind at all, even if the original excavator himself had an agenda. And here's the second takeaway. When you hear news stories about archaeology, don't trust journalists about archaeology. Don't trust politicians about archaeology. Be careful about when, that is time of the year, you read and where, what newspapers, what publications you read about archaeological news stories. Note who is giving the interpretation of archaeological finds and why they might be interpreting it the way they are. If it's not an archaeologist talking, and even sometimes when it is, always take it not just with a grain of salt, but take it with a whole salt shaker. And that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was great. So we do have a few questions for you. So bear with me as I look through them. So here's a question. Israel and surroundings have been the setting for many fiction stories. Daniel Silva and Nelson DeMille, and how accurate are some of those stories, or what's the history in those stories?
Right. So the only Daniel Silva I've read is about Rome, so I can't speak specifically to how well he does with Jerusalem. It really depends a lot on the author. So for instance, a good one I would say is, what's her name? Anita Diamond, who wrote The Red Tent maybe 15 years ago. That is a historical fiction that really, it's not just about Jerusalem, it's about all of the land of Israel, that is set in the period of Jacob and Jacob's children, Joseph and his brothers and sister, Dinah. And that is a really great example of using archaeology properly, doing one's research and getting it right. And this is an oldie and kind of a goodie. James Michener's The Source is probably the most famous one, and it's based on the excavations of Megiddo, a very famous site. In fact, my very last slide, my thank you slide, was a shot of the site of Megiddo. And Michener did his research and got a lot of the archaeological and historical details right. But it really, really depends on the author. There's some fiction that's really bad and doesn't do its research archaeologically as well. Yeah.
Thank you. And then I have a question. You know, you talked about the destruction on the Temple Mount, the bulldozers. So the question was, how was that allowed? How did they ever get that in operation going?
Great question. It wasn't allowed. I mean, it was completely illegal. And what happened was the Israeli authorities tried to stop it. But because the Israeli authorities, and this goes back to before there was a state of Israel, when, and it goes back to well, British Mandate times and Ottoman times, the Waqf, this religious authority, has always given authority of the mosque area to the, well, let me restate, I said the sentence backwards. Whoever is the political power in a charge, whether it was the Ottomans or the British or the Israelis or the Jordanians, they've always allowed the Waqf to have religious authority on the Temple Mount. And the Israelis, of course, continued that tradition in 1948 and 1967, I should say. So the Waqf basically acted without permission of the Israeli authorities because they have a certain amount of leeway, and it was stopped, right? They did build their new entryway to the new mosque, but the destruction was stopped as soon as it could be, but it went on for much too long because the Israeli, probably a war would have started had the Israelis stopped it sooner. That's kind of the answer. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. And another question, how strong is the archaeological evidence that the Wailing Wall was part of the Second Temple?
Very strong. Yeah. So when so the Second Temple was built way back in the Persian period, and it was probably a pretty small area at that point, and it stayed a small area until we get to Herod. And Herod, who was a great builder, he built Masada, he built up the port city of Caesarea, he built a city, Herodium, which he named after himself. He was a great builder. He had many flaws, but building was something he was very good at. And he built this entire area. He almost, I mean, I'm not a construction person per se, but he basically almost lifted up the existing Second Temple, flattened out the area, made this huge mound into a flattened area, and relayed the Second Temple on top of it, building this temple platform. Structurally speaking, the blocks of stone that make up the Western Wall, as well as the Southern Wall and the Eastern Wall and the Northern Wall, are all Herodian in style. They have a particular kind of embossing, which is purely related to the time frame in the building projects of Herod. So it's pretty clear that this is all Herodian. Yeah. And I should also point out that the Western Wall that all Jews go to pray at and have for a long time is actually technically not the Western Wall of this temple itself, but of this surrounding temple platform complex. So the temple itself is probably a bit to the northwest.
Interesting.
Yeah, and today, for the last 5 or 10 years, there's these temple tunnels, which have been excavated and opened up to the public, that you can go into these tunnels. I've never done it myself, actually, from the men's prayer area on the Western Wall complex. And you can actually wind your way through to what both archaeologists and religious authorities consider to be the place closest to where the temple itself once stood.
Thanks. And just a question really about your personal journey and how you developed your interests in archaeology and history and these specific topics.
Sure. So I've always really been interested in ancient history and archaeology of Israel in particular. My own background, I'm Westchester born and bred, and went to Westchester Day School, followed by Ramaz. And my interest in the history really began from studying Jewish history and being extremely frustrated with my high school curriculum for for neglecting the physical side of things, neglecting archaeology, and just doing sort of typical. My question was always, well, how do we know that? And most of my teachers couldn't answer that. And then I discovered archaeology is actually the way to get to the answers. So learning the Bible in day school environments kind of is what got me to my interest in archaeology. And then I majored in archaeology as an undergraduate and went on to graduate school to study the archaeology of ancient Israel in particular. And the rest is history, as they say.
The rest is history, so thank you. Let me look and see if we have any more questions. No, I don't see any more questions. And just a question about all the denial. Maybe you talked about this a little bit, kind of the response of the Israelis to the deniers, and how is that publicly responded to, if it is?
Right. Well, it's a really interesting question. I think to their credit, the Israelis have not responded directly. Scholars tend to respond more directly than political authorities. Political authorities stir up trouble in other ways.
Right.
But it's and I also, you know what, let me kind of answer your question. It's a great question. I want to answer it in a different way. I should point out that there are some Palestinian archaeologists, certain Palestinian universities. Berzit University has a now growing archaeology department, and Palestinian archaeologists who are sometimes trained in the West, sometimes trained locally, are becoming more and more involved. And those who are well trained as archaeologists, Palestinians who are well trained as archaeologists, would never engage in this. Okay, so I want to make clear that Palestinians, of course, our scholars are involved, and this isn't Napoleon, French in Egypt and appropriating. Palestinians are encouraged to be part of their own history building. But as far as these claims, as you saw, it's mainly Muslim political figures who are doing this, and they're refuted by scholars a lot of the publications I've shown you are translated into English. They're in the Arabic press. So Mahmoud Abbas would probably never make the statement that I read to an English language newspaper. But there are organizations that monitor the Palestinian press, and that's how I got them. But there is really a disconnect, a purposeful disconnect in how the Palestinians describe temple denial to their own people, which they do as incitement, versus to the Western world, which wouldn't accept such incitement.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we've asked a number of questions. We want to thank you so much for being
Thank
with
you.
us this morning. And maybe once we go back to in person, you can join us for bagels and lox, and
I'd be
we'll have
happy
have some
to.
fun.
And in a last quick bit of self-promotion,
Sure.
I'll say for people who are interested in this kind of topic, we do have, two colleagues and myself have a podcast, and we post a new episode almost every 2 weeks. It usually has to do with the archaeology of Israel. Sometimes we go beyond Israel to Egypt, but we do tend to concentrate on Israel. So look me up.
Okay, great. If you want to send me a link or the podcast info, I'll share
I
it.
will send you a link, and if you can bear with me for 1 second, I will share my screen again momentarily to
Thanks.
tell you to look up, if you're interested, This Week in the Ancient Near East. You can, if you're
Thank you.
savvy, you can scan that, or you can just look it up, and I can send you the URL for sure.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, everybody, have a good rest of the day, and thanks for joining us today.